Everybody, thanks for tuning in. I'm joined with Richard Diver from Microsoft, a peer of mine, and we're really excited to talk to you about Azure Active Directory and its integration with Amazon Web Services. So before we jump into the content, I figured we'd do some quick introductions. So I think everybody knows who I am. Welcome to the channel. But Richard, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, Matt, thank you. Yeah, I'm Richard Diver. I'm a technical business development manager for Microsoft. I help our partners to learn all of our security and compliance technologies. And this is one of the things I get to do all day. So good to chat.
Awesome. Well, we're pretty excited. Let me share my desktop. Let's jump into this. We've put together some pretty cool content here. So Richard, what are we looking at?
Yeah, so this is a challenge that we see quite a lot of customers have. Is if they're into AWS and Azure on-prem, they're all over the place. How do you get security around AWS is really the main question. There's a lot of different ways of dealing with it. Some customers will use ADFS with AD on-prem, or they might use some third-party identity providers. And what I want to show is a way of combining Azure Active Directory along with Microsoft Cloud App Security and Azure Sentinel. And by using these three together, we can then help the administrators and developers have an easier sign-in process into maybe more than one AWS account. And at the same time, we can protect those sign-ins as well throughout the session.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So you had put together a document here, and we have some folks collaborating on it. What's the document all about?
So
talk us through that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea of the document is that there's already a lot of guidance out there on how to do individual pieces of it. And I know that the team at AWS also released a video back in February, which we'll put a link to. So there's lots of good advice out there already, but the harder thing is putting it all together in quick, easy steps, and then finding any issues where it doesn't work that trips you up. And I think me and you have both been through some of those areas where it just needs a little bit of extra love and care. So the idea of the deployment guide is that you can then follow this guide beginning to end, and by the end of it, you'll be up and running. I've had it up and running within 30 minutes, end to end. And then sometimes we've seen there's a little bit of a delay sometimes in synchronization. It takes a little bit longer, but we'll go through those details in a bit.
Great. So from a high level architectural perspective, let's just maybe talk through some of this, and then we'll jump over to the demo and take a look at the admin portals. But we're looking at connecting Azure Active Directory to AWS as an identity provider. And there's some work, obviously, we need to do in Azure AD and in AWS to be able to make this work. So Richard, when we start doing the mappings here between the blue box and the orange box on the right, what are some of the best practices or some of the things we might want to call out for folks as they start getting into this? What should they be aware of?
Yeah, certainly. And again, this is where we're just extending on the existing guidance. So what I recommend when you're doing this testing is to have one account that is for an AWS admin and another account that's for a developer, and give them different roles and permissions inside of AWS. So on the left-hand side, you'll see is the Azure setup. So it's a normal Azure AD user called Test AWS Admin and Test AWS Developer. They get added into a security group, which you would either do as a static assignment, or you could actually do it dynamically with something like Privileged Identity Manager and allow elevated access. These are then added into an application. The application is called AWS, and I've put it as account one. You might want to create more than one, or you might just want to create a simple one. That's on the Azure AD side. On the AWS side, we make use of the existing roles that they already have inside of AWS. This is what makes this so much simpler to deploy. If they don't have any roles defined, then you would go through and create them. And for this example environment, we're going to create one called our Azure AD admins and our Azure AD developers to show they're coming from Azure AD, not that they're administering Azure AD. So we show as they're coming from Azure AD, they're going to be an admin in AWS, and we'll give them full admin access. And the developer will give restricted access. You can pick just a few roles to give an example that they are specifically, depending on what their group they're put in on the left, defines which role they'll get on the right. And the only other part to think about here that's really important, and this is the one bit that can trip us up, is the role mapping. So as part of setting this up, and we'll go through the UI, we have to make sure these roles we've defined in AWS appear in Azure AD so that we can actually assign them to the right groups. Otherwise, the whole thing falls apart pretty quickly. But once you've got that set up, then everything else is easy.
Very good. So let's jump into the admin portals and let's take a look.
All right.
So I am going to bring up my Azure portal first. Let's go through that. So I've added AWS as an enterprise application in Azure Active Directory. And when I've added it, I've done a few things here right off the bat. Under single sign-on, we've enabled SAML, and we've gone through and started filling out the different fields. Now, Richard, remind me, by default, it's going to automatically fill in your SAML configuration, so you shouldn't need to worry about these URLs, right?
That's right. And the user and attributes as well. These are all set up by default. These are quite standard. There may be some custom things you might want to change later, but for the purpose of testing and getting it working, just go with the defaults. Yeah.
Yeah. And now it does have you set up a sign-in certificate. So the first time you do this, it's going to ask you to create one. And once you create it, that'll be used for sign-in SAML requests. You do need to download the Federation metadata XML file because we're going to upload that to AWS. I've actually already downloaded that. I mean, as far as single sign-on is concerned, that's really it. We're going to do the rest over in the AWS portal. There is a couple other things that you want to do. One of those items is if we come over to users and groups, you're going to need to add a user that you're going to want to grant permissions to it. Now, we'll talk more through this coming back in just a moment, but not only do we need to add the user here, but you also need to add the appropriate role. And we'll come back to the roles here in just a moment because we've got a few tips and tricks on that one. And then when we come back to roles, we'll talk through provisioning. But as far as single sign-on is concerned, it's pretty straightforward. So let's jump over to AWS for a moment. And I've brought up IAM. So I've just gone down here and launched IAM. And I've gone ahead and created a couple of user accounts here. But before we do that, the most important thing is obviously we need to create an identity provider, and I need to sign back in here. So give me one moment to get signed back in. We need to create an identity provider. So let's talk through that. So let's go ahead and get logged back in.
And it's probably worth mentioning here, if you show the users group, normally in an AWS environment, what you would see here is user accounts created for each of the administrators and admin and developers that want to sign in. So they have what's basically a local account inside of AWS. Now, if the company has multiple AWS accounts, they'll end up with multiple user IDs and passwords across the whole estate. And that's what we're trying to solve for here, is not have to go and create any users, and you won't see any created actually in AWS. We create them all in Azure AD, and then they sign in as an external identity, given all the rights and roles as if they were a local user.
Yeah, that's really good to know. So the first thing we want to do is obviously create a identity provider, which I've already done, but let's just go through the motions of doing it. So when you click on create provider, you're going to choose your provider type. We're going to choose SAML. You're going to give it a name, and then you're going to upload that Federation metadata XML file that you downloaded from Azure Active Directory. So that's a pretty simple step. Once you upload it, it's going to go through and start doing the motions with you. So to create the identity provider, it's pretty straightforward. Once it's created, Richard, what's the next step we want to do?
So the next thing to do is look into roles. Now, each of the roles, if they're existing, they may already be linked to an existing service ID, or by default, they'll be using internal IAM from AWS. So for this testing purposes, I would always recommend you create a new role. And when you create that new role, you'll see our one we already have here at the top is the Azure AD AWS SSO. This is assigned to that identity provider. So we know that then any identity signing in from that identity provider will be associated to this role. And this is one of the roles that we can create. We can create multiple roles.
Yeah, pretty easy. Once we get the role created, this is what we're going to provision and let it sync over back in Azure Active Directory, which we'll talk more about here in just a moment. So once we create the role, we then need to create some users and get them mapped, right?
Yeah, and we can do that back in the Azure AD side.
Yeah. So this is where we need to make sure we talk through what's happening here. So we can provision the user accounts using Azure AD, obviously, and then once they get provisioned, in my lab, we've got just my standard user added. If this is production, we'd obviously want to have a security group of some sort. Right. But when I add the user, I need to assign it a role. Now, when you first do this, it's not going to have the role assigned. We'll need to synchronize that role from AWS, and this is where provisioning comes in. Now, I already have this occurring, and if this was your first time doing this, it's going to ask you to enter some credentials, such as a shared secret here, and any kind of mappings, which I'm not doing any kind of mappings. Obviously, you want to set up a notification email, so if something happens and it fails to sync from AWS to Azure, it's going to notify you. And then you want to flip your provisioning status to on. Now, to do the admin credentials, if we come back over to AWS and we pull up our user account, we have Azure AD Role Manager, and then we go to Security Credentials. I've created, you can see I've done this a couple of times now, I've created an access key ID, which creates what we need for this screen here. So it's going to create our client secret and our secret token. So
it's basically a service account, and all of that's in the deployment guide. So we'll take you through that step by step on everything you have to do there.
Yeah. Make sure you write that down or put it in a safe spot. And then once we flip it to on, you're ready to go. Now, this can take up to 24 hours to do its first initial synchronization. So make sure you keep that in mind as you plan for this and go through it. Now, in my environment, I only have one role. If we go back to AWS, I just have one role that I created, so it's only going to sync one role. And you could always go into the audit logs to check that. Once the synchronization has occurred, then we can go to users and groups, and we can assign that role to that user.
Yeah, this is one of the key points to look at. If you don't see this list of roles, you just see default, then you haven't got it set up right. So this is the point to stop and look and make sure this is working. Once you can assign one role, now you can. This is where you can add multiple groups like the administrators and the developers and give them different roles for each group they're a member of.
Yeah, and I actually made that mistake where I didn't have it provisioning correctly, and it wasn't syncing over the role, and so I went to go try to test SSO, and I got a bunch of SAML errors. So make sure you have that role assigned, and in order to get the role assigned, you have to synchronize it and just set up provisioning like we just talked about, and give it up to about 24 hours. I would say give it a good day for it to synchronize over. Once that's happened, that's really it for set up single sign-on. At that point, you can log into myapps.microsoft.com, and then AWS will be listed, and then from here you can launch it, and it will log you into AWS. Okay. And from that point forward, it's going to be pretty easy. Now, a couple things you might want to remember. I mean, we're doing this in a lab environment for demo purposes here, but what you probably want to do is make sure that you take some considerations into the role that you're creating. Obviously looking for, let's go into it here. Obviously looking to make sure you've got the right policies attached. I have administrator access attached to mine. You may have different requirements that might dictate otherwise, but what you do here is going to impact the SSO operations. So just make sure you do good coordination and planning on this part. And the document talks through all that, right?
Exactly. It's all good role-based access controls, least privilege. Don't give people access they shouldn't have access to. Even this administrator access, you shouldn't give to just anybody. So maybe what we can do next is show, now that we've got SSO working, all the other protections that can be enabled quickly. The important thing about this deployment guide, it was also intended that we deal with a lot of incident response issues as well, where customers may or may not be attacked on their network, or may not have lost credentials and might have somebody running around causing damage. And so the idea of this was to build out a very fast deployment guide that, should AWS be one of those areas you're concerned about, you can gain control quickly. So once SSO is done and up and running, now we can go and create conditional access policies and enforce things like multi-factor authentication, the ability to only sign in from specific laptops or IP addresses or countries.
Yeah, let's talk through that. So let's go back. That's a great point. So let's go back to Azure AD. Now that SSO is configured, within my enterprise app here for AWS, we're going to scroll down and click on conditional access. And for me, this is where a lot of interesting value starts to come out. Actually, before I talk about that, just don't forget, I could always look at the audit logs here and the sign-in logs for operations with AWS. So we'll come back to login here in just a moment, but let's click on conditional access. And this is where I can start creating policies. So I can start assigning this to, maybe administrators or, all users. And I can come in here and choose my app. It could be AWS. I could start setting a number of different conditions. Commonly, there's requests that if we have somebody log into AWS, maybe they're an administrator, obviously let's require multi-factor authentication. There might be different requirements for a SAW or a PA, a privileged access workstation, or a secure admin workstation. That's where I may want to make sure that workstation is joined to the domain or hybrid joined to Azure AD. Maybe I might want to do some compliance checking with Microsoft Endpoint Manager. And so this gets pretty interesting when I start thinking about governing access to AWS and just providing some additional controls around that. Now, what else is interesting is being able to set conditions and being able to lock this down from specific locations. So whether it's GeoIP or IP addresses of maybe an office or a certain location, that's totally doable. And then also locking it down from specific types of operating systems, OS. Richard, probably my favorite part about this is the risk-based. And so if I start enabling this says, well, if I have somebody logged into AWS and their user accounts found to be high risk, maybe their credentials are up for sale on the dark web or impossible travel or some kind of malicious scenario. Well, now we could block access to AWS. Exactly. So that's pretty cool.
It's one of the most powerful tools we have is Azure AD and this conditional access policies. I think we'd recommend everybody takes time to build this, test it, build block policies. That's really what's missing by default is block by default. So if you're really worried about AWS, block everything that you don't want to happen, and then go and create an allow policy that allows you to do it under specific conditions. The one I like as well is the session controls, just at the bottom of that list. So if you go through and were to say, anybody trying to get into AWS, I'm now going to put a session control on, you could then monitor. We'd set this as a custom policy. And then over in MCAS, or Microsoft Cloud App Security, we could then monitor the actual AWS session and prevent the upload or download of malware or DLP type content. So if you had certain project-specific data or anything that was sensitive of any type of information that you didn't want transferred to or from the AWS environment, you can block that now all through a combination of Azure AD on the identity side and Cloud App Security on the CASB side, monitoring that session for the entire time.
That's really good. Let's actually jump over there. SSO is obviously important. It's the building block to all of this. Conditional access, MFA, everything we just talked about. But you got a good point. Being able to do session control, but then just audit like a flight data recorder in an airplane, audit all activity and operations in AWS, and that's where Microsoft Cloud App Security, Microsoft's CASB comes in. I've got this set up in my environment. If we go over here to the sunglasses and click on connected apps, I've gone ahead and integrated AWS with my environment. And so when you click on it and we edit those settings here, I created a service account that I'll show you here in just a moment. And I've created the access key and basically the shared secret. And so if we jump back over to that environment and we go to AWS here, let me back up to my users. Here we have the MCAS AWS service account that we've created. And then we're using that shared secret over here at MCAS.
Yeah. And what happens as soon as you do that connection, then we start to read all of the logs from that service and we try to understand what's happening in that environment. So we can then see activities such as somebody trying to log into AWS and maybe they failed getting into Azure AD, but they can successful when they log into AWS, and we detect those kind of behaviors, or they were successful on one and failed on the other. And we're also looking again for all the uploads and the downloads, just really user behavior activity that would be potentially malicious.
Yeah. Here's my activity log, and I've got it filtered to AWS. And so here you can see all the activities across AWS, both user activities, admin activities. When I click on one, I've got all the information, the telemetry I need here to understand what's happening. And then I can start doing cross correlation of that activity against other activities. Is it triggering any kind of alert policies, so on and so forth. So that's pretty interesting. I think that's pretty cool. The other cool part about this, if we go back to investigate on the sunglasses and we go to connected apps, I'm going to click on security configuration. And so I've added AWS to this, which allows me to then look at, if you're familiar with SecureScore, Microsoft 365 or in Azure, it's kind of like looking at SecureScore for AWS. Here's a set of recommendations from the Center for Internet Security, or CIS, that's going to come back for my AWS environment that I can then follow these recommendations to better secure it. So I'm
Yeah,
pretty
it's
excited
pretty
about
powerful. It's pretty
that. Yeah.
powerful, isn't it? Yeah. And then the one last part of all that is you could also pull this data into something like Azure Sentinel if you're
Mm.
using that for your SIM. And then we can look for additional threats against advanced threat hunting, machine learning. We have threat intelligence in there. And a lot of this is based on what our own threat hunters have found from customers that have had some kind of exposure. And we've gone in, done the investigations, understood how the attacker took advantage of that environment. We now look for those inside of the logs. So I don't know,
Yeah.
Matt, do you have Azure Sentinel set up as well?
I don't. We'll have to do another
Okay.
video for that, and also Azure
All right.
Security Center. So we'll save that for another video.
Yeah, that'd be great.
But you mentioned session policy. Maybe let's talk about that a little bit. So
Yeah.
I'm going to come over here to policies, and I'm going to create a session policy. WinCAS is great. It's very useful, and one of the examples you gave was, maybe we might want to just block a file download from happening. So here in my policy, I could just build out a simple filter that says, look, if you're trying to download files from, say AWS or any of these apps, then we can inspect it, look for some kind of sensitive data, if that matters, maybe some kind of code, whatever it may be, and then I can block that file. If it's an Office document of some sorts, then we can also apply a Azure Information Protection label to it as well, and then encrypt it upon download. But what's interesting about this is we could put the user on Rails. So I like to think of scenarios where they're working remotely and maybe they have a non-managed computer. Allow them to access AWS and get the job done, but again, put them on Rails so that they can only do certain activities. So like one of my common use cases is let's block, cut, copy, and paste. We can do that, or blocking certain activities as part of that session.
Right. Yeah,
So that's pretty cool, pretty powerful.
It is cool stuff, and untapped potential. There's so much you can do with this that it can be overwhelming. So again, we give you the guide, follow through the guide. You'll get at least the basics set up very quickly and easily, and then go from there. Once you see what you can do with a very easy, and you can see I do diagrams all over to make it as easy as possible to get through. But by the time you get to the end of this document, you'll be fully set up for secured logins, watching the session, preventing uploads and downloads. Malware, we'd throw a malware test in there so you can prove that should you try to put malware from your PC into your AWS environment, we're going to block that in the session itself. So we're not relying on any PC or any other software involved, just the fact that I signed in and I'm now being monitored by MCAS. So, yeah. So we'll put a link in the video description to the document here, along with some other resources. We should probably talk about that briefly. There's resources such as an article that walks you through how to connect AWS to MCAS. We'll be sure to link to. And then as far as Azure Active Directory is concerned, not only follow the document we talked about, but there's also going to be an article that will walk you through that. So we'll provide a link to that. And then lastly, the AWS team, they did a really cool video back in February of 2020 about how to integrate Azure AD with AWS and use it as an identity provider. So Yuri and Laura here, they did some good content on that. So we'll put a link to that as well, so you can watch that. But there's a lot of resources, and this document is meant to really help you through it. And if you have feedback as you go through it, let us know. Just post a comment or reach out to us on LinkedIn or Twitter, and we'll make sure we get that incorporated. We have a lot more videos coming on AWS operations here with Microsoft security products, so stay tuned for that. But Richard, is there anything we want to leave them with? No, that's it. Like I said, just let us know what you think, and look forward to the feedback. Thank you. Awesome. Well, thanks, Richard, for taking the time, and thanks everybody for watching, and we'll catch you later.